الرحيم نحمد ونصلي على رسوله الكريم أما بعد فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون صدق الله العظيم وصدق رسوله النبي الكريم ونحن على ذلك لمن الشاهدين والشاكرين والحمد لله رب العالمين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي رب زدني علما اللهم صل على محمد عبدك ورسولك وصل على المؤمنين والمؤمنات والمسلمين والمسلمات. In today's Taraweeh Salah we heard the 23rd juz starting from Surah Yasin, then we have Surah Safat, Surah Sad, and finishing off with Surah Zamar. And these surahs which we have in front of us are all Makki surahs. In the ahadith, many virtues and benefits of Yasin Sharif has been mentioned. In one narration of Tirmidhi Sharif, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam says, narrated by Anas radiallahu anhu, that everything has a heart. There's everything that has a focus point, the main pump, the main function. And the heart of the Quran is Yasin Sharif. And in another narration again by Anas radiallahu anhu, he said that whosoever recites Yasin, he will be given the reward of reciting the Quran 10 times. By reciting the full Yasin Sharif once, the person will be given the reward of reciting the entire Quran 10 times. In one hadith of Darimi, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says that reciting Yasin Sharif in the morning, then the task and the work for the rest of the remaining day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make it easy for him. And a person who recites it at night time, then in one narration, the remaining task of the night will also become made easy for him till the morning. And in one narration, he says that person who recites it in the morning, then the rest of the day will become easy and there will be goodness until the evening. And the reciting in the evening, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring goodness till the morning time. So there are many other virtues as well in Yasin Sharif. We should make the habit of reciting Yasin in the morning. And if we were to continue reciting it, inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will make it easy for us to recite and will become on our tongue very easily, especially though non-hafiz, continuously reciting it, Allah will make it easy for us. Now this Yasin Sharif that we have, before that in the previous juz, there was a surah called Surah Saba. Now in Surah Saba, one of the subject that was mentioned in there was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He cleared the false belief that people had. And the belief that they had was that people and some other beings, other creation, can intercede in order to change the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that's what one of the subjects that was in Surah Saba. And in that surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He clarified that. And in the remaining next few surah, in Surah Yasin, Surah Safa, Surah Sad, and Surah Zumar, this has also been discussed where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He clarifies and clears that the intercession can not change the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala unless the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is there. And in Yasin Sharif, the surah itself begins with the word Yasin, which is from the Huruf Muqatta'at. Huruf Muqatta'at, we have Alif Lam Mim, Kaf, Haya, Ain, Sad, etc. There are few surah of the Quran that begin with these words. They are known as Huruf Muqatta'at. Now the correct meaning of these Huruf Muqatta'at, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the knowledge of. Only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has the knowledge of the correct meaning of these Huruf Muqatta'at. Now one area that is covered in Yasin Sharif is about the Tawheed, about the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then we have about Risalat. Then we have about Qiyamat, Day of Judgment. Mufti Asir Sahib, alhamdulillah, has been going through the tafsir of Yasin Sharif in detail every Wednesdays. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept the effort and the durus and make it a means of having a greater understanding of this Yasin Sharif itself. Now in here, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, one of the themes of the surah is about believing in Allah, worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and only He will be the one that can help, and He has a complete authority to prove this, there are certain ayats in the surah itself to show the qudrat and the greatness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and to show that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that worthy of being worshipped. In ayat number 31, أَلَمْ يَرَوْا كَمْ أَهْلَكْنَا قَبْلَهُم مِّنَ الْقُرُونِ أَنَّهُمْ إِلَيْهِمْ لَا يَرْجِعُونَ وَإِن كُلٌّ لَمَّا جَمِيعٌ لَدَيْنَا مُحْضَرُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He's talking about the previous nations. That have you not seen so many of the nations that because of their denial and because of them rejecting, we destroyed many of them. We destroyed many of them, and some of them we wiped out completely. And they will never ever return back to this world. They will never return back to this world. Yes, on the day of judgment, they will be presented before us, and they will have to answer for their behavior and their and how they rejected their message. So they will have to answer that. So this is the qudrat of Allah, that nobody could stop this punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala coming. Like this in the next وَآتُ اللَّهُ مِنَ الْأَرْضِ مَيْتًا أَحْيَيْنَاهَا وَأَخْرَجْنَا مِنْهَا حَبًّا فَمِنْهُ يَأْكُلُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is drawing our attention to a barren land, to a land which is dead, to a land which is dry, and then only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give life to that such barren land where nothing was growing, but through the qudrat of Allah, through the power of Allah, now this same land which was dry is moist, and there's crops and there's fruits and there's plants and there's trees growing on this, and this land has become flourished. So this is who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, that He can bring something which had no life and give it at life as well. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who is worthy of being worshipped, and there is no one else who has the qudrat of this. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentions about وَآيَةٌ لَهُمُ اللَّيْلُ نَسْلَخُ مِنْهُ النَّارَ فَإِذَا هُمْ مُظْلِمُونَ وَالشَّمْسُ تَجْرِي لِمُسْتَقَرٍّ لَهَا ذَلِكَ تَقْدِيرُ الْعَزِيزِ الْعَلِيمِ. In here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling us to ponder upon the night itself, that the night itself is a sign for us, where we can draw lessons out, and we can understand that how the night comes and the day disappears, and the day appears and the night disappears. And in this also there's a sign for the believers, and also for the sun, the moon, when they rise and set. In there Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put a lesson for us, and to where we can also understand the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then in this, لَشَمْسُ يَنْبَغِي لَهَا أَن تُدْرِكَ الْقَمَرَ وَلَا اللَّيْلُ سَابِقُ النَّهَارِ وَكُلٌّ فِي فَلَكٍ يَسْبَحُونَ. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says that the sun and the moon, they have a orbit, that they orbit, and this orbit is through the hukm of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and they don't change their orbit. And the وَكُلٌّ فِي فَلَكٍ يَسْبَحُونَ is where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that they have the orbit and they swim and they flow in that orbit. And the Mufassirun explain here the beauty of this kullun fi falakin yasbahun, where this is mentioned that the orbit of the sun and the moon is that if you have the word kullun fi falak, and if you were to read that way, it'll be kullun fi falak, and if you read the other way, it's also kullun fi falak. The ya is in the middle, and all the other letters together, if you were to read right and left, they both make the same word, kullun fi falakin yasbahun. Again, this is the beauty of the Quran itself and the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And many other points have been mentioned about the qudrat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here. Then later on we have another verse of the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is drawing our attention about the day of judgment, where He will say that وَامْتَازُوا الْيَوْمَ أَيُّهَا الْمُجْرِمُونَ. He will separate the believers and He will separate those who are the criminals, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take judgment on that day. And then few verses after, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون. A verse which should remind us about how we are going to be accountable on the day of judgment, how every action of ours is recorded, and where we will not get away from any evil, any sin, any shortcomings. Everything will be recorded, and on the day of judgment will be presented of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In this ayat, the hadith about Abu Musa al-Ash'ari radiallahu anhu, he says that on the day of judgment Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take account of everybody, and the mu'minun and the believers will be called in front of Allah, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will put a veil between the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Himself and the believer and the rest of the humans. So everybody will be there present, but between the believer and Allah, between the believer and Allah and the rest, there will be a veil put there, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will directly ask this believer about his life, about what he has done, and the believer will say, yes, I've done this and I've done this, I've done this, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through His mercy could forgive them. However, a disbeliever or sinner will be called forward, and he will be told to come forward, and he will be questioned that, look, you've done this and you've done this, you've done this wrong, and you've done that wrong, and you've said this wrong, and you've hurt this person, and this person now will start denying it. Look, I didn't do this, I didn't do this. The angels must have made a mistake in recording this. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here in this verse says that Abu Musa al-Ash'ari radiallahu anhu said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will pull a seal on the mouth of that person, and the rest of the body now will speak. Beginning from the right thigh, and the rest of the body will start speaking and will become a witness against him. Therefore, when a person is in this world, when we do a good deed, there are certain witnesses for us. The angels themselves record it. The piece of land where we are doing that good deed, it becomes a witness for us. And also our limbs of the body will become a witness for us. And sometimes when we are, for example, coming for Eid time, we are told to recite the takbir, tashriq loudly, and the surroundings, we are going in that direction, also becomes a witness for us, the plants and the stones and etc. So like this, there are many witnesses for us. And Allah protect us if a person was to commit a sin, even though he may be doing it in the privacy of and nobody is seeing him, but there are angels, there's a piece of the land and its surroundings that will become a witness against him and the limbs of the body. Therefore, a person should remember this verse and think that if I am not, trying to get away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this world, I may be able to hide and get away from it from the other people, but on the day of judgment, I will be questioned and I will not be able to hide myself. So a person, when he does sincere tawbah, the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that He wipes away the record from all of these. The angels forget it, the books is deleted from the books completely. The piece of the land that had the sin was done upon, even the piece of land is made to forget about the sin that was committed. So this ayat should become a means for us to stay away from the disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And there are many other topics in this Surah Yasin itself. Then we had Surah As-Saffat. Surah As-Saffat, again, as we mentioned, it also has a similar subject to the previous surahs, and also mentioning about that it is only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who can intercede and who can give the permission of intercession. No being can change anything that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decides, and the other creation are in need of Allah. The angels are in need of Allah, the prophets are in need of Allah, and every other being are in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The beginning of this surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He talks about the angels, was-saffat, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, was-saffat yasaffa, that those angels that will be standing in the saf, in a row, in a straight row in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And here, the call is that even the angels will say that we are, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one who is worthy being worshipped, who is worthy being worshipped. Therefore, do not think that the idols will intercede for us and take you into paradise. The idols won't have that chance of interceding, because only Allah is the one who's the worthy of being worshipped. There's nobody has that intercession on the day of judgment except for whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grants permission of. Then in this verse, in this surah, there is a mention of the people who will be going into Jannat, what they will be given. Thereafter Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the next page talks about those people who will be Jahannam. What will there be food, and how will they will be punished in the hereafter in the Jahannam itself. And in this surah there's a mention of couple of Anbiya, couple of prophets. Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam has been mentioned, Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam has been mentioned here. Then Musa alayhi salatu wasalam, Harun alayhi salatu wasalam, Ilyas alayhi salatu wasalam, Lut alayhi salatu wasalam. And the point of these is that all of these prophets, they were at that time being persecuted or hurt in other way, in one way or the other, and it is only Allah who saved all of them and rescued all of them. It is only Allah who rescued all of them. So this means that even the prophets are not worthy of being worshipped. They are also in need of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's assistance and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's help. So they cannot do anything for us as well as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can. And we all know the story of Yunus alayhi salatu wasalam is also mentioned in here, that it was in the stomach of the whale. And it is only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who saved him and protected him from at that time. Then we've got the greatest, the incident of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam. فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ مَعُهُ السَّعْيَ قَالَ يَا بُنَيَّ إِنِّي أَرَى فِي الْمَنَامِ. Many lessons from the life of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, such as loyalty, obedience, ready to sacrifice everything. So much so that he left his own family members around and ready to sacrifice his own sin. And all of this is just to gain the happiness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So many lessons that we learn from the life of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam. And the other prophets have been mentioned in this surah as well. Then we have the greatest, the incident of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam. فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ مَعُهُ السَّعْيَ قَالَ يَا بُنَيَّ إِنِّي أَرَى فِي الْمَنَامِ مَنَامِ. Many lessons from the life of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam. And the other prophets have been mentioned in this surah as well. And one of the points that's also mentioned, that some people would believe that the angels are the daughters of Allah. In the previous surah, it has been mentioned that they believe that the angels are the daughters of Allah. However, the end of this surah, to Safat, فَاسْتَفْتِهِمْ أَلِرَبِّكَ الْبَنَاتُ وَلَهُمُ الْبَنُونَ, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives an answer to them. That you say that the angels are daughters of Allah and you're ashamed to have your own daughters and you're burying them alive yourself. So how can you say your God has a daughter and you're ashamed of your own daughters? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given a couple of answers refuting them about their belief about the angels being the daughters of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the end of the surah, we finished the surah by Subhana Rabbika Rabbil Izzati Ma Yasifun wa Salamun ala al-Mursaleen walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. These words are very heavy on the day of judgment, on the day when our weight, these going to be weighed. They are going to have a lot of weight on the day of judgment. This also is a part of the dua that we recite at the end of the gathering. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdika ashhadu la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk. And then we complete our gathering with this. Why? Because in our gathering, if you have made any mistake, any shortcomings, we may have forgotten to mention Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That mistake and that weakness and that shortcoming, by reciting this dua, it is hope, we have the hope in the mercy of Allah that He will forgive us and forgive, do not make the gathering time for us to be questioned about. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give us the understanding and also give us the ability to touch ourselves to the Quran Sharif and make the most of the remaining nights of the month of Ramadan. Allahumma ameen. Subhanallah bihamdi. Subhanakallah wa bihamdik. Nashhadu la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati ma yasifun. Wa salamun ala al-mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alamin. Bi rahmatika ya arhamar rahimin. Amin ya rabbil alamin. Jazakallah. Those brothers who are here for the 48 hours at TIKAF, kindly request to gather in the corner there, inshallah. The last final, inshallah, discussion.